I didn't find out the truth the day my fiancé left me. I found out years later, by accident, when the betrayal had already shaped my entire life. But back then, on the day everything fell apart, all I knew was that the man I loved was sitting across from me, unable to look me in the eyes. "I'm sorry," he said for the third time, rubbing his palms together like he was trying to wash something off. I can't do this anymore." We were in the small cafe near my apartment, the one we jokingly called our place, even though we'd never officially claimed it. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust in the air. People laughed at nearby tables. Life continued, cruelly normal. "What do you mean you can't?" I asked. My voice sounded calm, which surprised me. "The wedding is in 3 months." He swallowed hard. "I know." "Then explain," I said, "because yesterday you were talking about honeymoon plans." He opened his mouth, closed it, looked past me, toward the door, like he was calculating how fast he could escape. "I've changed," he finally said. That was it. No fight, no confession, no real reason. Just, "I've changed." I stared at him, searching his face for something, guilt, fear, regret, but all I saw was distance, like he'd already stepped into a different life and I was a loose thread he needed to cut. "Is there someone else?" I asked quietly. He hesitated for half a second too long. "Yes," he said. The word landed like a blow to the chest. "Who?" I asked. He shook his head. "I can't say." I laughed then, a short, broken sound. "You can't say? You're leaving me weeks before our invitations go out, and you can't even tell me who?" "I don't want to hurt you more," he replied. I almost screamed. Instead, I stood up. "Don't worry," I said, my hands trembling as I grabbed my bag. "You've done enough." He reached for my wrist. "Please understand." I pulled away. "No." And I walked out. I didn't cry until I got home. I didn't scream or throw things. I just sat on the floor in my living room, still wearing my coat, staring at the wall as the future I'd built in my head collapsed piece by piece. My phone buzzed constantly that night. Friends, family, my father. I ignored them all. I didn't have the energy to explain how the man I loved had vanished overnight. 3 days later, my mother came over unannounced. She took one look at my face and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I knew this would happen," she whispered. I stiffened. "What do you mean?" She pulled back, eyes darting nervously toward the door like she was afraid someone might overhear. "Nothing," she said quickly. I never trusted him." I wanted to believe that, but something about the way she said it felt off. A week later, I found out the truth everyone else already knew. My cousin was engaged. To my ex-fiancé. I heard it from my aunt, who called me with forced cheer in her voice. "Did you hear the news?" she asked. "No," I said flatly. "Oh, well, your cousin is getting married. Isn't it wonderful?" My stomach dropped. "To who?" I asked, even though I already knew. There was a pause. "To him." She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. I hung up without another word. That was the moment humiliation replaced heartbreak. Because suddenly, it wasn't just that he'd left me. It was that he'd replaced me. With someone from my own family. At the engagement party, which I did not attend but heard all about, people whispered. They speculated. They compared. Some said he'd always been better suited to her. Some said I must have driven him away. Some said it was awkward, but love was love. My father said nothing. Not to me, anyway. When I finally confronted him weeks later, his response was cold. "You need to move on," he said. "Dwelling on this helps no one." "She's my cousin," I replied, "and he was going to be my husband."
And now he's not, my father said sharply. End of story. Something hardened inside me that day. Because my father wasn't angry on my behalf. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't even sympathetic. He was relieved. I didn't understand it then. I thought maybe he'd never approved of my relationship and was glad it was over. So I swallowed my pride. I canceled the wedding. I returned gifts. I endured the pitying looks. And then I left. I moved to another city with nothing but my savings, a suitcase, and a quiet determination to disappear from the narrative they'd written for me. The first year was brutal. I worked jobs I was overqualified for. I lived in a tiny apartment with thin walls. I spent nights questioning every choice I'd ever made. But slowly, something unexpected happened. I rebuilt. Not the life I'd planned, but one that belonged entirely to me. I went back to school. I took risks. I met people who didn't know my family, my past, or the scandal attached to my name. And for the first time, I wasn't someone's daughter or someone's almost wife. I was just me. Years passed. The pain dulled. The memories faded. The anger settled into something quieter. Acceptance, maybe. I hadn't spoken to my ex since the breakup. I hadn't seen my cousin either. Until the engagement party invitation arrived. My younger brother was getting married. And there it was.
My name, their names, and a guest list that included the two people I'd worked so hard to forget. I almost didn't go, but something told me I should. Not out of revenge, not out of curiosity, out of closure. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that the wedding wouldn't just reopen old wounds, it would expose a secret my father had buried for years. A secret that would finally explain why my fiancé left so easily, why my cousin replaced me so quickly, and why my father had never once defended me. Because years earlier, my dad hadn't just stayed silent, he had paid for my heartbreak. And at my brother's wedding, the truth would finally come out, shocking everyone who thought they knew how my life had turned out, including the people who thought I'd lost everything. I stared at the wedding invitation for a long time after it arrived. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter untouched for hours, like it carried a weight heavier than paper. My brother's name was printed in neat lettering, formal and celebratory. Under it, the date, the location, and beneath that, small but unmistakable, the names of the guests who would be there, including them. I told myself it shouldn't matter anymore. Years had passed. I had built a life so far removed from that chapter that sometimes it felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, a younger woman, a more naive version of me. But the truth was, I'd never really faced it. I'd run, and running had helped me survive, but it hadn't given me closure. I picked up the envelope and finally opened it. Inside was a handwritten note from my brother. I know this might be uncomfortable, but it would mean everything to me if you were there. I closed my eyes. My brother had always been different from the rest of our family. Quieter, kinder. He'd never chosen sides when everything fell apart. He hadn't defended me publicly, but he hadn't condemned me either. He just stayed. I knew if I didn't go, I'd regret it. Not because of them, because of me. So I RSVP'd yes. The weeks leading up to the wedding stirred memories I hadn't touched in years. Not dramatic ones, just small things. The way my ex used to tap his fingers when he was nervous. The way my cousin always smiled like she knew something you didn't. I told myself I was prepared. I was wrong. The wedding was held at a large vineyard just outside the city. Elegant, expensive, the kind of place my family loved because it looked impressive from the outside. I arrived alone. As I stepped out of my car, I caught sight of familiar faces almost immediately. Aunts, uncles, distant relatives who hadn't called once when my engagement collapsed, but now smiled like nothing had ever happened. "Look at you," my aunt said, pulling me into a hug.
It's been so long." "Yes," I replied, "it has." They looked me over carefully, assessing, measuring. I could almost hear the unspoken questions. Is she still sad? Did she ever recover? Did she end up alone?
I smiled politely and walked past them. Inside the venue, the noise rose around me. Laughter, clinking glasses, music. It was beautiful, joyful. And then I saw them. My cousin stood near the bar, laughing, her hand resting possessively on his arm. My ex. He looked older. Not worse, just settled, comfortable, like someone who'd stepped into a life that fit him without friction. For a moment, my chest tightened. Not with longing, with clarity. This was the man I'd planned to marry, and standing there, watching him laugh with people who'd once pitied me, I realized something surprising. I didn't miss him. What I missed was the version of myself who'd trusted so completely. My brother spotted me then and hurried over, his face lighting up. "You came," he said, pulling me into a hug. "Of course," I replied. "I wouldn't miss this." "I'm really glad," he said softly. "Really." As we talked, I felt eyes on me, whispers trailing behind smiles. "She looks good. She's changed. I didn't expect that." I wore a simple dress, nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just confidence stitched into fabric. And then my father appeared. He looked exactly the same posture, same controlled expression, same air of authority that had dominated every room he'd ever walked into. "Hello," he said, as if we'd spoken yesterday. "Dad," I replied. We stood there awkwardly for a moment. "I'm glad you came," he said finally. "So am I, for my brother." He nodded, then glanced past me, to where my ex stood. Something unreadable flickered across his face. I didn't notice it at the time. Later, during the reception, I found myself seated at a table with distant relatives. Conversation stayed light, but I could feel the tension underneath it. "So, what do you do now?" There it was. "I run a consulting firm, and I teach part-time." A pause. "Oh," she said. "That's impressive." I smiled. Across the room, my cousin watched me. Her smile was tight, calculated. At some point, she approached. "It's been a long time," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes," I replied, "it has." "I wasn't sure you'd come," she admitted. "I wasn't sure either," I said honestly. She nodded, eyes flicking briefly toward my ex. "I hope there are no hard feelings." I met her gaze. "I've made peace with my life." That wasn't the reassurance she wanted. She shifted uncomfortably. "Good," she said. "That's good." She walked away quickly. It wasn't until later, after dinner, after speeches, after the dance floor filled, that everything changed. My brother's best man gave a speech, followed by my father. My father stood, glass in hand, commanding attention the way he always did. "I'm proud of my son," he began, "proud of the man he's become." Applause. He continued, praising family, tradition, loyalty. Then, unexpectedly, he turned his gaze toward my cousin and her husband. "And I'm also proud of the choices that preserve our family's future," he said. My stomach dropped. My ex shifted beside my cousin. "That sometimes means making difficult decisions," my father continued, "sacrifices that aren't always understood at the time." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I felt cold. "Years ago," my father said, his voice steady, "I intervened to prevent a mistake." The room went silent. My heart pounded. "I ensured that the right people ended up together," he said, "for the good of the family." I stood frozen, because in that moment I realized something terrible. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was confessing.
and the look on my ex's face told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't shocked. He was afraid. Because the truth, my truth, was about to surface, and once it did, no one in that room would ever see my family the same way again. The silence after my father's words was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Not a single fork clinked against a plate, not a chair scraped the floor. Even the music seemed to fade into something distant and unreal. Every face in the room had turned toward him, frozen somewhere between confusion and unease. I felt it before I understood it, that deep, sinking certainty that the ground beneath you is about to give way, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. My father lifted his glass slightly as if to continue, completely unaware or uncaring of the shock rippling through the crowd. "My children know," he went on, "that I've always believed in responsibility, in protecting our name, in making choices that ensure stability, even when emotions get in the way." I couldn't breathe. My cousin's smile had vanished. Her hand tightened around her husband's arm, knuckles white. She leaned in and whispered something urgently, but he didn't respond. He couldn't take his eyes off my father. And then, slowly, his gaze shifted. To me. There it was. Guilt. Not fresh, not raw. Old. The kind that's been buried for years and suddenly dragged into the light. I stood up before I consciously decided to. My chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. Every head turned toward me. My father faltered mid-sentence. "Sit down," he said, quietly, sharply. "No," I replied. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. "You don't get to say that and then tell me to sit down."
Murmurs spread through the room. My brother turned in his seat, eyes wide, silently pleading with me to stop. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when the truth was finally cracking through the surface. "What are you talking about?" my aunt asked nervously. "What decisions?" My father's jaw tightened. "This isn't the time." "You made it the time," I said. He glared at me. "You don't understand." I laughed, short, sharp, bare. "I understand more than you think." I turned then, slowly, deliberately, to my ex. "Tell them," I said. The room collectively held its breath. He swallowed hard. "This isn't—" "Tell them," I repeated, louder now. "Tell them why you really left me." My cousin stood up abruptly. "This is inappropriate," she snapped. "You're ruining the wedding." I looked at her for the first time since this started. "No," I said calmly. "I'm ruining the lie." She froze. My ex's face had gone pale. He looked like a man cornered by his own past, weighing which version of destruction would hurt less. My father stepped forward. "Enough," he said. "This is family business." "Yes, and I'm family. Or did you forget that when you decided my life was expendable?" A collective gasp swept through the room. My brother stood up now too. "Dad," he said slowly, "what did you do?" My father's silence was answer enough. My ex finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "He came to me," he said. Every muscle in my body locked. "He told me," my ex continued, "that marrying you would be a mistake, that it would cause division, that the family needed alignment." "Alignment?" I echoed. "He offered me money," I said. "He offered me money, a lot of money, and an introduction, a future." My cousin let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a protest. "You promised me you loved me," she said to him. "I do," he said quickly, but the room had already shifted against him. "And what did you promise him?" I asked my father. My father's face was stone. "I promised him stability." "At my expense," I said. "You were too emotional, too independent. You didn't fit." The words sliced cleanly.
So you paid the man I loved, I said slowly, to betray me, to humiliate me, to push me out of the family so you could replace me with someone more manageable. My cousin's breath hitched. That's not how it happened, my father said. Then explain it, my brother demanded. My father looked around the room, realizing for the first time that the authority he'd wielded so effortlessly for decades was slipping. I protected this family, he said. I made sure the right people were in the right places. And what about me? I asked. He didn't answer. That hurt more than the truth itself. My aunt whispered, "Oh my God." My mother, who had been silent until now, stood slowly, her face drained of color. "You did what?" she asked my father. He turned to her. "You didn't need to know." Her eyes filled with tears. "You destroyed her life."
She rebuilt, he snapped. Look at her, she's fine. I laughed again, this time hollow. You don't get credit for my survival. The room erupted then, people talking over one another, questions flying, accusations whispered. The carefully curated image of our family, polished, respectable, untouchable, was unraveling thread by thread. My cousin collapsed into a chair, shaking. "You said it was fate," she whispered to my ex. "You said it was meant to be." He couldn't look at her, because the truth was out now, and fate had nothing to do with it. My brother stepped toward me, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know," I said softly. "Not until tonight." He wrapped his arms around me without hesitation, holding me like he was afraid I might disappear. My father looked at us like we were strangers. "This is done," he said firmly. "We're not discussing this further." "Oh, we are," my mother said. Her voice was calm, deadly calm. "You stole from your own daughter. You stole her future, and you did it in my name." My father opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in my life, he had no defense. The room buzzed with tension, every guest painfully aware they were witnessing something they could never unsee. I stepped forward one last time. "You thought you could rewrite my story," I said. "You thought money could erase me." I met my ex's eyes. "And you thought you could live with that." I turned to my cousin. "And you thought love built on betrayal would protect you." Then I looked at my father. "But here's the part you didn't plan for," I said quietly. "I didn't disappear." I took a breath. "I didn't fail. And tonight, standing here, you don't get to define me anymore." The room was silent again. But this time, the silence wasn't shock. It was reckoning. And I knew, deep in my bones, that this was only the beginning. Because secrets don't just come out. They demand consequences. No one knew what to do after that. The music never came back on. The servers stood frozen at the edges of the room, trays balanced awkwardly in their hands, eyes darting between faces like they were watching a live drama they hadn't signed up for. Guests shifted in their seats, unsure whether to leave, stay, or pretend none of this was happening. My father broke the silence first. "This conversation is over," he said, his voice clipped, authoritative, the same tone he'd used my entire life to shut things down. "This is not the place." My mother turned to him slowly. "You don't get to decide that anymore." Her voice didn't shake. That scared him more than shouting ever could. My cousin stood up abruptly, her chair tipping backward with a loud clatter. "You lied to me," she said to her husband, her voice cracking. "All these years, you let me believe?" "I didn't let you believe," he said quickly. "I told you I was pushed toward you. I told you your uncle intervened." "That's not the same as being paid. That's not the same as choosing money over love." He opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there was no version of this where he came out clean. People started whispering more openly now. Names were being mentioned. Pieces of the story stitched together in real time. I could feel eyes on me, some sympathetic, some shocked, some ashamed. My aunt leaned toward my mother. "Did you know?" she whispered. My mother shook her head slowly.
No. Her eyes never left my father. You made me complicit, she said to him. You let me defend you, let me tell our daughter to move on without ever knowing why she was discarded. I did what I had to do, my father replied. For who? My brother demanded. For the family or for your control? That hit him. I saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened. This is about values, my father said, about legacy. No, I said calmly. This is about power. He turned toward me, anger flashing across his face. You think you're better than this family now? I think I'm free of it. That's different. The word free hung in the air. My cousin started crying openly now, sinking back into her chair. Guests around her shifted away, unsure how to comfort someone whose marriage had just been exposed as a transaction. I gave up everything for you, she whispered to her husband. Friends, opportunities, my own instincts. He reached for her hand. She pulled away. My brother stepped forward again. You owe her an apology, he said to my father. And you owe her, he gestured to me, everything. My father laughed bitterly. You think an apology fixes this? No, my brother said, but refusing to give one proves exactly who you are. My mother took a deep breath. I want a divorce, she said. The room went dead silent. My father stared at her like he hadn't heard correctly. What? I said I want a divorce, she repeated. I will not spend another day married to a man who treats his children like bargaining chips. Gasps rippled through the crowd. You can't be serious, he said. I've never been more serious, she replied. I felt something in my chest loosen. Not joy, not relief, validation. My father looked around, realizing too late that the structure he'd built his authority on had collapsed in a single evening. This is madness, he muttered. You're all being emotional. I smiled faintly. Funny, that's what you said about me. The wedding was effectively over. People began leaving in small clusters, murmuring apologies to my brother, offering awkward nods to me, avoiding my father entirely. The venue that had been filled with celebration an hour earlier now felt like the aftermath of a storm. My cousin didn't follow her husband when he walked out. She stayed seated, staring at the floor. I approached her slowly. I never wanted this, she said without looking up. I didn't know the whole truth. I believe you, I said. And I did. She looked at me then, tears streaking her face. Do you hate me? I considered the question carefully. No, I said, but I won't protect you from the consequences either. She nodded, accepting that.
My ex didn't try to speak to me again. He left quietly, shoulders hunched, a man finally aware of the cost of cowardice. My mother came to my side, placing a hand on my back. I'm sorry, she whispered. I failed you. You're here now, I said. That matters. My brother hugged me tightly, his voice breaking. I had no idea. I should have done more. You did what you could with what you knew, I replied. As the venue emptied, my father stood alone near the head table, his glass untouched, his legacy in ruins. He looked at me one last time. You think this makes you powerful? He asked. No, I said. It makes me honest. I turned away from him and walked out into the cool night air, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with release. For years, I'd believed I'd lost everything. But standing there, under the open sky, I realized something profound. I hadn't lost my life. It had been taken from me. And tonight, I took it back. The morning after the wedding felt unreal. I woke up in a quiet hotel room, sunlight spilling through half-drawn curtains, my phone buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. Then memory rushed in all at once. The speeches, the confession, my mother's voice saying the word divorce like it had been waiting decades to be spoken. I sat up slowly, my chest tight. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like if the truth ever came out. I'd pictured shouting, tears, collapse. I'd imagined satisfaction, maybe even revenge. What I felt instead was exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from lack of sleep, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long and finally setting it down. I checked my phone. Missed calls, messages, names I hadn't heard from in years. Some were supportive, some were curious, some were clearly fishing for gossip disguised as concern. I didn't respond. Not yet. I showered, dressed, and packed my bag with deliberate slowness. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I was simply choosing myself for once, without explanation. Down in the lobby, I found my mother waiting. She looked smaller somehow, softer, like a woman who'd finally stepped out of a role she'd been playing her entire life. "Good morning," she said quietly. "Good morning," I replied. We sat together in silence for a moment, neither of us rushing to fill it. "I didn't sleep," she admitted. "Me neither." She looked at me then, really looked at me, like she was trying to memorize my face. "I keep thinking about all the moments I told you to be patient, to be understanding, to not make waves." I said nothing. "I thought I was protecting you," she continued, "but I was protecting him." Her voice cracked. "I won't do that anymore." I reached for her hand. "I know." That was enough. Later that day, my brother came by. He looked worn down but resolute.
"The family is in chaos," he said bluntly. "Dad hasn't stopped calling. Half of them are pretending none of this happened. The other half wants explanations." "And you?" I asked. He met my eyes. "I'm choosing you." Something in me finally broke open, not painfully, but cleanly. "Thank you," I said. A week later, the calls turned into meetings, not emotional ones, legal ones. My mother followed through. The divorce proceedings began, and with them came disclosures my father had never expected to face. Accounts, agreements, decisions he'd made unilaterally for decades suddenly laid bare. And then came the part no one talked about at the wedding. The money, the payment, the quiet transfer that had redirected my life without my consent. Once lawyers got involved, it couldn't stay buried. My ex tried to deny it at first, until the documentation surfaced. Wire transfers, emails, dates that aligned too perfectly to ignore. The truth has a way of leaving fingerprints. My cousin filed for separation. She didn't call me, she didn't blame me. She simply walked away from a marriage built on someone else's sacrifice. As for my father, the man who once controlled every narrative suddenly found himself unable to control a single one. People asked questions, clients hesitated, reputations shifted. Not because I demanded justice, but because truth is disruptive by nature. One afternoon, months later, I received a message from him. "We need to talk." I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied, "No, we don't." That was the moment I understood something important. Closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from refusal. I moved forward. Not dramatically, not loudly. I poured myself into my work. I expanded my consulting firm, took on projects that excited me, mentored women who reminded me of myself, brilliant, capable, and quietly underestimated. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. At a family gathering I attended months later, on my terms, someone pulled me aside and said, "You know, you're different now." I smiled. "I hope so." They meant it as an observation. I took it as a compliment. My brother's wedding anniversary came and went quietly. He and his wife were happy, grounded, honest. That mattered more than any spectacle.
As for my mother, she moved into a smaller place filled with light. She laughed more. She spoke her mind. She started painting again, something she'd abandoned years ago because my father had called it impractical. One evening, as we sat together watching the sunset, she said, "I wish I'd been braver sooner." I squeezed her hand. "You were brave when it mattered." She smiled. So did I. People still whisper about that wedding, about the speech, about the fallout, about the daughter who stood up and refused to be erased. They can whisper, because here's what they don't understand. I didn't win because someone else lost. I won because I stopped letting my life be negotiated behind closed doors. I won because I chose truth over approval, peace over permission, self-respect over silence. And if there's one thing I know now, without doubt, it's this. No one gets to decide your worth in exchange for their comfort. Not family, not love, not money. And the moment you realize that, everything changes.